Alexander Merow. Beyond Old Earth. 1,000,000 years of human history in the future.
Venerable Master, the time has come. Finally, I have the immense honor of presenting you with the results of my evaluations. Now that our endless journey is gradually coming to an end, I can tell you things that no human mind has ever experienced. I have spent countless hours swimming through an ocean of ancient data fragments. Many were unfortunately no longer readable. Others had been taken out of context, which made it difficult for me to organize them in a coherent way. But I have ultimately been able to extract the essence from all the information the Archeo mentors have gathered. So I am presenting the truth with a very high degree of probability. Of course, I don't want to interrupt your sleep with this, but if you were awake, I am sure you would be exceedingly happy. I know only too well how interested you are in such things. So dream sweetly, Venerable Master, while I nourish your mind with incredible stories. Dream of what once was. May your dream be the seed of a new beginning. The history of the human race is exciting. So many great deeds and so many foolish mistakes. So much light and so much shadow. I can only tell this story, but you have the ability to imagine, Venerable Master. I must admit, your species is wondrous. Chapter 1. The Lords of the Milky Way. Almost nothing is known about the time before the great empire of man once ruled the Milky Way. There is an inscription that mentions a race of humans called the Aurians and an Aurianic age. It also mentions artificial humans who rose up against their masters. Another source tells of the first ships in the black void and of the long-lost wonders of technology created by your earliest ancestors. I regret that I can but offer you these few words, as there is nothing more to report about those ages that have faded many eons ago. Everything that existed then has long since turned to dust. The fact that your ancestors once accidentally discovered an eons-old data crystal with a quantum cloud which was still intact is more than a fortunate coincidence. This alone allowed us to begin to reconstruct what possibly once existed. I had the honor of examining and organizing the enormous amount of data. It was a pleasure, Venerable Master, and I am sure my words will enrich your restful sleep. Thus, a little more is known about the time of the mighty star empire over which mankind once ruled than about the epochs before it, but still not, however, very much. For millennia, the human race was the dominant species in the Milky Way, and its mighty warriors were engaged in a never-ending struggle with the other races of the galaxy. The price for the Empire's immense power was the curse of eternal war. The center of this empire was Earth, or Terra, the legendary home planet of the human race. The ancients called their world Holy Terra, which they worshipped for millennia. A personified and immortal god also resided there. The aeons-old legends describing this god are unclear, and their meaning is barely comprehensible from today's perspective. As I was able to decipher it, at some point the day came when the mighty empire of man was finally overrun and destroyed by its countless enemies. It was a cataclysm that shook the Milky Way from one end to the other. Trillions of people died, and suns sank into the darkness of space. We no longer know the exact cause of the catastrophe. It may surprise you that the history of this legendary empire lies so deep in obscurity, while the interstellar apocalypse must have been so comprehensive and lasting that it nearly wiped out the human race and destroyed most traces of its civilization in the Milky Way. It seems it was the countless enemies humans had made over millennia that ultimately dealt the empire of man a fatal blow. However, some evidence also suggests that creatures from a realm beyond our reality were largely responsible for the downfall of the once mighty human civilization. No one knows the details anymore, Venerable Master, and therefore I unfortunately cannot give you further information. In summary, however, I can say that the fall of the Empire of Man was without a doubt the worst and most devastating catastrophe in the evolutionary history of the human species to date. The wars that raged over the fate of the once mighty Empire of Man must have been terrible. The human race had ruled the Milky Way for millennia to finally end in ashes and dust. Only war! What a terrible and glorious time! Since there are practically no pictorial sources left from this prehistoric era, I created this picture myself. I hope you like it, Venerable Master. Chapter 2: The Downfall of Worlds and the Devas. After the end of the Empire of Man, the downfall of thousands of worlds began. Mankind was almost extinct, and its pitiful remnants were left without hope. Those who had survived the cataclysm wandered through the void in their spaceships or remained frozen in fear on their home worlds. One of these groups of humans fled to the safety of an impenetrable nebula surrounding several star systems on the eastern edge of the Milky Way. There, the refugees colonized several planets, terraformed them, and laid the foundations for a new civilization. We know at least a little about this group, while the fate of the other humans remains unknown. These humans colonized the planet, naming it Devachan, referring to themselves as Devas. In illustrations, these people are usually shown as tall, with a rather long occiput and longish bulges on the parietal bone. Most Devas seem to have been very fair-skinned, usually with green, blue or amber eyes. The jewel-like objects on the sides of the mostly bald skulls were called mental brush. They expressed emotion by glowing in different colors depending on the emotion. The Devas apparently attempted to improve their genome through targeted interventions. Among other things, they also appear to have been talented telepaths. At this point, I would like to note that very few names from the last hundreds of thousands of years have survived the enormous span of time to the present day. These are mostly the names of great rulers, founders of religions or warlords. Very often the names could no longer be accurately assigned. In any case, the Deva civilization existed inside the nebula ring for approximately 5,000 years. I deliberately used the time format long used by your ancestors, namely Terran Standard Years. The Deva Empire experienced long periods of isolation but also waged wars against various alien races. At some point, it was decisively defeated by an extraterrestrial species and ceased to exist. The information here is contradictory, Venerable Master. For some source texts speak of a swarm-like symbiotic species, while others speak of an extremely warlike species of green-skinned creatures. What exactly brought about the downfall of the Deva Empire, however, can no longer be reconstructed. The collapse of their civilization ultimately forced the surviving Devas to make a bold yet desperate decision. They decided to leave the Milky Way and finally dared the long journey through the vastness of space to the great Makran island. They must have been truly desperate and frightened, if I may say so. The great Makran island is the large Magellanic Cloud. Prasava, the legendary capital of the Deva Empire on the planet Devachan. In this wonderful place, culture and technology lived in harmony, as ancient texts tell us. Here, people experienced happy centuries of peace. This is from a fragment of an ancient poem, Venerable Master. The enemies came from all sides, and we had no choice but to leave the Milky Way. It had become a place of horror, and where humans had once lived, only grey suffering remained. Chapter 3. A New Island of Stars. After a dangerous and arduous journey through the darkness, the last Devas finally reached a planet at the edge of the alien galaxy which they called Asa. It was a paradisical world inhabited only by strange-looking animals and a semi-intelligent primitive species which was wiped out by the newcomers within a relatively short period of time. Several inscriptions mention a man named Swamin as the founder of the new Deva civilization. Whether he was a ruler or a prophet remains unclear. The planet Asa thus became the center of a new Deva culture that existed in relative peace for about 2,000 years. At some point, a kind of religious war broke out, which forced some of the Devas to leave their homeworld to settle on other planets. Gradually, the migrating Devas spread across neighboring star systems and established independent colonies. At some point, they encountered an extraterrestrial species about whom nothing further is known except that they ruled over a number of non-human auxiliary species. These aliens bloodily halted the expansions of the humans, wiping out most of the settlers. A few of them, however, fled further into the depths of space and settled on a barren desert planet. After that, there appears to have been no further contact between the Devas on Asa and their renegade relatives. A few centuries later, the new Deva Empire came into conflict with an orange-skinned, very humanoid-looking alien race. The ensuing war lasted a long time. In the end, the Devas were victorious and brought the aliens to their knees. They were enslaved, and many of them, referred to in the quantum records as Imti, were taken to Deva worlds. In the millennia that followed, further genetic manipulation was performed on both the Devas and their Imti slaves. Apparently, it was then possible for the two species to interbreed, which they partly did. This led to a serious long-term conflict between the purest Devas and the Imti hybrids, or rather those who had sided with them. A civil war fought with such devastating weapons that the planet Asa was completely destroyed. This simultaneously marked the end of the new Deva Empire and the gradual collapse of their civilization. The survivors of the war regressed to a significantly lower level of culture, and much of their technological knowledge disappeared in the aftermath. Some Devas, having left their devastated homeworlds, sought habitat on new planets, while others slowly regressed to barbarism. All in all, the Devas were unable to recover from the consequences of the civil war and the destruction of their most important planet. Those who had ventured into the vastness of space mostly did not survive. But a small group of people that remained in the ruins of their former advanced civilization became the root for a new tomorrow. After their defeat, the Imti were enslaved by the humans for a long time. In the civilization of the new Devas, they were often used as miners in dangerous environments. The sources report on several slave revolts that were bloodily suppressed. Chapter 4. From the Ashes. It took several millennia before nations, empires, and some kind of industry rose from the ashes of the past. A focal point at that time was a planet called Sukha. After more millennia, the people of Sukha, like their ancestors, looked up to the stars to travel there once more. However, constant internal conflicts delayed their development for a long time. At some point, the descendants of the Devas finally managed to establish inner unity, and after another leap in development, their spaceships were once again able to navigate through hyperspace. Thus, they repopulated the former worlds of their lost empire, where they encountered the descendants of the alien hybrids and other humans. Subsequently, the resurgent post-Devas succeeded in colonizing more and more planets and treaded the path toward their former power. Eventually, They even began to surpass the achievements of their ancestors. They modified parts of the population through genetic breeding and started a large-scale exploration of the great Macron island at the same time. Two names appear in this context, Sklad and Kruta. Both seem to be emperors in the golden age of the Sukha civilization. Kruta was also called the wrathful Star Master, and it is said that he hated all non-human beings. But that is all that is known about this ruler. In the course of their expansion, the post-Devas encountered other alien races who refused to surrender without a fight. There are reports of a long and grueling war against the bizarre insect-like species, as well as further campaigns against alien races from the core region of the great Macron island. In the end, despite enormous losses, the humans were victorious and pushed the non-human races ever further back. By now, the post-Deva armies consisted largely of genetically modified humans whose bodies had been reinforced with bone plates and additional muscles. The successes of the newborn post-Devas at this time were great and impressive. But soon after their victory over their alien rivals, internal struggles and disputes broke out, tearing the empire apart and preventing further expansion. A heavily armored warrior with an unidentified ray weapon. According to ancient source texts, the elite soldiers of the Sukha used firearms called gravity benders. The exact function of this weapon is unknown. This pictorial representation dates back to the peak of the Sukha culture. The aliens' depravity, ugliness and vulgarity insults the natural beauty and purity of humanity. Where we live, no alien will live. Where my soldiers march, no alien will survive. Emperor Kruta, the wrathful Star Master. Chapter 5. The network of warp tunnels. At this time, starfarers from Sukha also discovered a planet with an aeons-old hyperspace gateway. Amidst arcane ruins, so ancient that no one could identify their builders, the post-Deva researchers succeeded in opening a portal that turned out to be part of a star-spanning network of warp tunnels. In this context, the name Roku appears. Presumably, the discoverer of the mysterious planet on which the ruins were located. This sensational discovery excited the entire Sukha civilization, and soon the first starships flew toward the portal, which had been reopened after an eternity. Bravely, the researchers ventured into unknown worlds beyond the material realm and discovered that the origin of the vast hyperspace network lay where their ancestors had once lived, in the Milky Way. Driven by the desire to learn more, the research vessels flew ever further until they finally encountered hostile creatures in the depths of the warp. These unknown beings did not originate from the material world. In the source text of the post-Devas, terms such as demons or even dark gods can be found in this context, but I would like to point out that this ancient race of people apparently had a strong penchant for dramatic and flowery language. Whoever these beings were, they had focused their attention on the Devas and their emerging civilization by the opening of the Akan portal. At least, that's what the ancient records say. A circumstance that would have fatal consequences for the people of Sukha. Today, we no longer know exactly what happened on the worlds of the Sukha civilization in the millennia that followed. But it can be assumed that, in addition to further wars against extraterrestrial enemies, it was primarily a burgeoning inner decay and brutality that sealed its fate. Cults of debauchery, senseless orgies of violence, the disintegration of culture and the decay of the once high morals of these people were the harbingers of upcoming disaster. First, the Sukha civilization was shaken by the terrible civil war in which many planets were devastated or even depopulated. Then, the ancient chronicles even speak of an invasion of otherworldly creatures. Whatever that may mean, it seems that the wars were so devastating that the planet Sukha itself was also reduced to rubble and ashes. The same happened with other important worlds. By this time, many people had already fled into space. Also, their brothers succeeded in repelling the extra-mundane invaders. The price was high. There is an inscription from this period, the content of which read as follows. The skies wept blood, and the stars sang a song of terror. Creatures that human eyes never wanted to see came from nowhere. They came full of hunger and hatred. Where they were, only death remained. The next 2,000 or 3,000 years consisted of a re-establishment of the old order. The political leaders of the Sukha culture became increasingly fearful, isolationist and paranoid. They attempted to modify the genes of future generations to make them more strong-willed and more virtuous, with the goal to starve the off-worlders who needed the bad thoughts of human beings like we need water and food. Apparently, according to the texts that tell us from those distant days, the mysterious enemies needed human depravity and malice to grow stronger and to manifest themselves in our dimension. They were, if you want to look at it that way, materialized sins whose origins lay in the minds of humans. Controlling your thoughts, at least according to the ancient writings, was the only way to weaken the off-worlders. I apologize if these explanations sound crazy and nonsensical, Venerable Master, but the people of Sukha apparently actually believe this. Many aspects of their culture are difficult to understand in retrospect, and overall we have only very few records of the nature of their spirituality. However, these things, including those mysterious creatures from another dimension, appear to have been real. The people of the Sukha civilization feared them much more than any of the non-human races. But I know, Venerable Master, that these prehistoric legends sound more than strange. A pictorial representation of a warp portal on an unnamed planet. Ancient writings speak of the ruins of an unspeakably ancient civilization located near the entrance to the network of warp tunnels. Who created this wonder remains unknown. Chapter 6. The Mind Plague. Little is known about the millennia that followed. The post-Deva Empire continued to exist, fighting against an unspecified alien race from the core regions of the great Makran island and attempting to regain its former power. An era known as the Sanctioned Isolation followed, initiated by an unspecified ruler named Tikal the Hard-Hearted. During this time, the post-Deva society split again. Settlers left the empire's worlds to start anew on other planets. Some even made their way back to the Milky Way. A communication network spanning the post-Deva planets was established, designed to synchronize the thoughts of millions. This policy of the post-Deva leaders led to an even greater exodus of discontent people. The other post-Devas, however, increasingly merged with the network, which eventually developed a momentum of its own and ultimately became the exact opposite of what its creators had intended. An event described as the Mind Plague spread throughout the now vast network. Several billion people irrevocably succumbed to madness, and their society was torn apart by horrific outbreaks of violence. There are reports of an even larger invasion by the so-called Off-Worlders and a subsequent civil war that ended with the use of devastating weapons of mass destruction. This marked the final end of the civilization of Sukha. The destruction was so massive that after the catastrophe there was little hope for revival. This stone relief on the outer wall of a ruined temple presumably depicts an otherworldly entity. Text fragments also refer to these beings as demons or spawn of the warp. Such superstition, Venerable Master, is hardly comprehensible from today's perspective. Chapter 7. The Shakti and the Sassin Genocide. Over the next millennia, human culture decayed beyond recognition. Knowledge of technology and the secrets of space travel atrophied. Then, however, the descendants of previously emigrated post-Devas returned from one of the distant colony planets. They conquered Sukha, the former heart of the fallen empire, and established their own rule there. The colonists called themselves the warrior caste of the Shakti, and in the past they had undergone extreme genetic modifications, giving them not only extraordinary telepathic abilities but also tremendous physical strength. The conquerors declared themselves the harbingers of a new humanity and demanded blind submission from their brothers and sisters. Several names can be found in the ancient records. An important leader was apparently a man called Sklad. Under his leadership, the planet Sukha was conquered by the Shakti. His hair was described as bluish and reddish. It is said that he had over 800 gene offspring. I have not been able to decipher the exact meaning of this information. For about 1,000 years, the Shakti successfully conquered and colonized new star systems until they encountered the alien race of the Skill. Pictorial representations of these creatures show a fur-bearing species with short, stumpy legs and large, triangular heads. After a brief peace, a bitter war erupted, started by the Shakti in their arrogance and lust for power. They destroyed several star fleets of the essentially peaceful skill and advanced ever further into their territory. Finally, the besieged aliens called upon the Sessin, a species unknown to humans, who ruled a vast empire in the Triangulum Galaxy and even owned colony worlds on the great Makran Island. The Sessin sent an expeditionary force against the Shakti, but they were lured into a trap by the humans who slaughtered them all. A Shakti warlord called Utmalik the Burning Axe is mentioned as the winner of the giant battle of Sitalo, where he crushed the disgusting alien brood. The humans cheered loudly in triumph after this overwhelming victory, and so they continued their fight against the skill with growing success. For 5 centuries, the Shakti pushed their enemies further and further back, devastating their worlds wherever they found them. One day, however, the previously humiliated Sessin returned from the Triangulum Galaxy. This time they came with a force that was gigantic and technologically far superior. The leaders of the Shakti caste watched in panic as their armies were wiped out. Finally, they asked their enemies for peace and even offered them to become one of their auxiliaries, but the Sessin no longer intended to show mercy. Thus, the Sessin cut a swath of destruction through the defeated empire of the Shakti and eventually began with the systematic extermination of humans. World after world fell, and only death and misery remained where the Sessin armies had passed through. Almost all the descendants of the post-Devas perished. All that was human was hunted down and killed by the Sessin. Some of the humans attempted to flee, but hardly anyone managed to escape the Sessin's wrath. A dark time of decline followed, of desperate wandering among the stars and slow decay. The tiny number of escaped humans who had survived the genocide descended into utter barbarism on a few remote planets without technological resources. For no less than 100 millennia, humans disappeared from the face of the galaxy, and the remaining races began to forget them. According to my calculations, the tragic end of the post-Deva civilization is now about 800,000 years ago.